Welcome to all my guests to take part in this panel. The issues, as you know, are about citizenship and immigration in the context of Brexit. Concerns about immigration were deemed to be one of the key motivators for the decision to leave the European Union. And for many voters, a desire to take back control of the country's borders trumped the widely predicted dangers of to the economy by leaving the bloc. And some of the concerns with immigration were explained by fears about access to jobs, about housing, healthcare, other public services being in some ways overstretched. But there was also considerable evidence being placed before the electorate to suggest that culture and identity were somehow being undermined by the presence of too many people coming from other parts of the world, but particularly from the European Union. So we have a wonderful panel here today to talk about issues of identity, to talk about those issues of immigration, to talk about them all in the context of this convention. And I want to start by introducing my panel. First, I have there, over on my right, David Goodhart, a well-known, really a contributor to great public debate over many, many years, well-known certainly to many of us here, and to me particularly. I've debated with him often, but he has written a really, really challenging and interesting book called The Road to Somewhere, and I recommend it to you as a provocative and interesting read. Here again on my right, another person with a really interesting book that has just been published in her name, Sayeeda Warsi, Baroness Warsi, a colleague of mine in the House of Lords, face each other on the benches but find ourselves often in agreement. She has written a book called The Enemy Within, and in it she really is looking at the whole issue of identity and the Muslim community here in Britain. I also have a very interesting collection of people who've been very active on many different issues concerned with identity with me too. I have Philippe Legrain, who is a visiting fellow at London School of Economics, and he was the founder of a think tank called Open. And Philippe, if you would like to wave, he's second on my left there. I also have with me Sashy Nathan, who is a colleague of mine in the law. He's had a very important advocacy role at 89 Up. It's called Advocacy at 89 Up, but he's the co-founder of a new project, which is a not-for-profit law firm called Commons. And it really is the sort of initiative that is unfortunately necessary now that legal aid has been so badly undermined. So Sashy, welcome to you too. He's here with me. I then want to welcome Faiza Shahi, who is the director of CLASS. Faiza, would you thank you for coming. And then, in addition to this panel, Mary Lou McDonald is the deputy leader of Sinn Féin. She was due to be on another panel, certainly that was what she was told. I'm told to absolutely shame Henry Porter for getting things confused. I'm not going to shame him because he's done wonders in organizing this whole convention and we love him dearly. Henry, one blip is absolutely forgivable, and Mary Lou forgives you, and we're very glad that we've now got you on this panel too. And she, of course, will be looking at issues of identity, how the impact of Brexit on Ireland, and the serious concerns there are around all of that. So I'm going to start by asking my panelists to really give us a sort of short bite of the contribution that they would like to make to this whole issue as they see the impact of Brexit with regard to citizenship, identity, immigration, and the like. And I'm going to ask you, Sayeeda, first to come on in and tell us how you have responded to recent events.
I suppose there's, good afternoon. I suppose there's a couple of short statements that I'd like to make. As we'd say in Yorkshire, we're all comers in at some point. And I think for me, the interesting debate about citizen and immigration is about how long do you have to be here before you belong? And in the Brexit debate, this became a huge part of the discussion. I fundamentally believe that Britain could chart its own path outside the European Union. I was what you would define as a hello world Brexiteer. a Hello World Brexiteer who in the end voted Remain, because I felt that fundamentally the arguments that we were making around the issues of citizenship and immigration for Brexit, i.e. A Britain which could reach out to the brightest and the best in the world, and we wouldn't be tied to a specific European project in terms of who we look like as a future nation, quickly became something very different. And as I said at the time, I found it difficult in the end to justify that those of my colleagues who were making the argument that they didn't want Britain to be open to Polish builders, Romanian fruit pickers, and you know, Portuguese doctors would somehow be open to Indian tech workers, Kuwaiti doctors, and builders from Turkey. And therefore, I think I got to the point where I felt that the Brexit debate around citizen immigration, which should have been hello world, this is what Britain can be in a big open space, anywheres, I think as you would define them, suddenly became little island Brexit. And that was the point where I felt that that was not a vision of Britain that I could vote for. One of the things that I talk about in immigration more broadly, I was a lawyer for many, many years, and I always argue that most immigration law is badly drafted and hopelessly applied. And one of the reasons why immigration has become such a toxic political debate is because there is always a sense that what we say we're trying to achieve is not what we're actually trying to achieve. I want to end really on a really personal issue. We always confuse immigration as, the debate around immigration is always confused. So we always confuse those who have been here for a very, very, very long time to those who have newly arrived. We always confuse those that are coming here and passing through, like students, to those that are coming here to settle. We confuse the distinction between asylum seekers and refugees. And more recently, in the right-wing tabloid press, will confuse immigrants with criminals. And I think that's part of the challenge around the confusion around immigration debate. And I always think part of that arrives from the fact that most people who migrate, most immigrants, don't know how their journey will turn out. And if I can end, like I said, with a very personal example, you know, I come from a family who came here in the 1950s, a community, a family that, as my father said, would always go back. So it was a migration to come here to work and go back. 1970 was the D-Day when we would return. It became a community that worked and settled and is now, as part of the broader Muslim community, seen as a community which is neither settled nor belongs. So I think I'll end it there.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
She's always like that. She takes instructions well. She only, you know, we're asking people to do it briskly. So I'm going to say to the rest of my panel, take your line from how Sayeeda's given us a quick burst of her view. I'm turning to you now, David, because your book, The Road to Somewhere, really is engaging with the with issues which are to do with identity and the politics of identity. And I want to just ask you, I mean, to what extent you think that immigration did play a role in delivering the Brexit vote?
Yeah, I think it was pretty central to it. I think if there was sort of a single most important reason for Brexit, it was probably people's realization after 2004, when so many more people came than had been expected. If you remember, we were expecting 15,000 people to come from Central and Eastern Europe when we opened our labour market 7 years before we had to. And then over the following 4 or 5 years, about 1.5 million people came. And it was people's realization that nothing could be done about that. Unlike the earlier period of post-colonial immigration, which had become, you know, there was friction in the early years, but by the 80s, 90s, it had been broadly accepted. But one of the reasons it was accepted is because there had been effective parliamentary intervention. There was downward pressure on quite sharp downward pressure on numbers in the 1980s. By the early 90s, we had zero net immigration, even minus net immigration in some years. Parliament was able to respond to people's feelings and anxieties. People discovered after 2004 that wasn't the case. And you know, they hadn't noticed the fact that in 1992, the European Union, we'd signed up to something called European citizenship. So not only did many, many more people come than had been expected, but we also discovered that we had to treat them as if they were British citizens in terms of access to the welfare state and social housing and so on. And that was also a bit of a shock. It conflicted with, I think, a perfectly legitimate common sense notion of national citizenship, in which national citizens come before non-citizens, at least in many important respects. So yes, I do think it was very important. I mean, I think looking forward, I think there'll probably be more continuity than most people are now fearing. I think there will be downward pressure on the low-skill EU immigration, although even there, I think that there will have to be care applied to that, so that whole sectors of our economy, food manufacturing, for example, our biggest manufacturing employer employs about 400,000 people. 120,000 of them now come from Central and Eastern Europe. That's just since 2004. I mean, that really is it's a very good illustration, actually, of how freedom of movement works fine, if you're a North London lawyer and you want to go and work in Berlin or Paris for a year or two and expand your horizons. It doesn't work so well if you're working in a fish finger factory in Hull. You do face a lot of competition. I think we will have downward pressure, and we will, in the longer run, I think, move to a system. I think we can square the circle, if you like, between the view of most people in Britain that immigration has been too high in the last 20 years, and we want to return it to more moderate levels. I think most people are not anti-immigrant, they're anti-large-scale immigration. They think the country has been changing too fast as a result of it. They want to return to a more stable and slowly changing society. I think we can respond to that and bring the numbers down, while also responding to the desire to remain a very open society and economy by making more and more immigration temporary, as actually a huge amount of it already is. People don't realize this, but the number of people, we have roughly about 600,000 gross inflows every year of people defined, if you come here for a year or more, you're defined as an immigrant, and about 300,000 net immigration. The people who have actually been accepted for permanent residence in the last few years has been last year it was as few as 60,000. The year before that, it was also below 100,000. And actually, if instead of the target of net immigration in tens of thousands, we'd had a target, which in some ways would have been more sensible, a target of permanent residence, then the tens of thousands would have been achieved. And I think the whole debate would have actually been very different. If I'm allowed just one other brief thought, because I wasn't quite sure whether we were talking about immigration or national citizenship, but I suspect part of the sentiment behind the question we're addressing is the fear that Britain is going to become a much more nationalistic and chauvinistic country as a result of Brexit. I think that's very unlikely. Indeed, I think in some ways it may, in the way that Brexit does allow us to kind of press the restart button in so many different areas, I think it may almost make it easier to promote a more, a kind of Danny Boyle benign nationalism. And I think, Britain is, like most European countries today, a moderate nationalist country, a moderately nationalist country. I mean, if you look at the data about what people say to pollsters, then chauvinistic views about the country have been in pretty sharp decline in the last 30 or 40 years. The number of people who think to be truly British you have to be white has fallen.
But David, I'm going to stop you because okay. What I want to stop you about, and I want to thank you for your contribution, but you're presenting it in quite a benign way, and you're one of our public intellectuals, and I wouldn't expect anything else. But in fact, in the way that it was presented during the run-up to Brexit, it was, as Sayeeda has said, in fact, drove Sayeeda away from her gut instinct to actually be against it, because it was ugly, and it was not presented in this rather kind of benign way about how one should be managing it. It was actually being presented in a really rather ugly, hostile, xenophobic way. So let's
so that is your belief, Helena, but where is your evidence for that? I mean,
well, it's obviously shared by an awful lot of people in the audience.
Well, that doesn't prove anything.
Anyway, sorry, I don't want. That's not helpful to decent debate. Come on. Okay, fine. You have your view. I disagree with you. I mean, obviously there were some xenophobic and chauvinistic people. There always are.
But the idea that they dominated the debate, I think, is completely wrong.
I think, David, if you look at the messaging that happened during that Brexit campaign, and if you looked at what people were responding to, I mean, let me give you an example. The day after Brexit in Barnsley, you know, not far from my hometown, when somebody was interviewed in the street and said, well, why did you vote for Brexit? He said, and this is what I mean about confusion, he said, because I want the Muslims out. So therefore, somehow, somewhere in that Brexit campaign, a message had gone out to him, voting Brexit means you can have the Muslims out. And what I said at the time, and you know, I watched the campaign from very close quarters, and I felt very quickly whether it was the issue of refugees, immigrants, allegations of rape in Europe from people who had migrated. All of those were starting to play out in terms of the messaging that was going out to Britain to say, if this is the kind of Britain, if we don't vote Brexit, then effectively, you know, paraphrase, our women are going to be raped on the streets. I mean, this was really nasty campaigning. And you might say, well, look, it was political campaigning. But for me, the means doesn't justify the end. Because if you run a toxic campaign, I think you end up with a toxic country.
This is anecdotalism. You're giving me one person in Barnsley. I mean, I've got lots of data. I have looked at public opinion on these issues. So I'm not going from one man in Barnsley.
You don't need to go from one man in Barnsley. You can you can look at the Vote Leave campaign. They've taken down the website, but it's been cached. Or you can look at the Breaking Point poster of Nigel Farage. Or you can look at the statements made by leading Conservatives who should know better, who decided to go full UKIP in order to win the Brexit vote. So it's not just a matter of opinion, it's a matter of fact.
I'm going to ask you, Philippe, to give your brief presentation on the perspective that you wanted to contribute to this discussion.
Well, the debate about citizenship and immigration is a debate about us, who we are, how we define us in a post-Brexit world. And some people want to divide us. They want to take a narrow, restrictive definition of us that excludes other people in this country on the basis of background, race, religion, birthplace, and so on. And that's not just politically dangerous and morally wrong. It's untrue because it seeks to deny the inescapable diversity of modern Britain. And so people like Nigel Farage, and indeed many people in other political parties now, love their country so much that they wish it were a completely different one.
It's a great line.
They tell us that some people like them, are the people, the real people, and that people who disagree with them are alien, or citizens of nowhere, or people from wherever. And that is nasty nonsense. And regrettably, some people have taken the Brexit vote as giving them license to abuse and beat up and even kill people who they think do not belong. Surely what truly defines us is that we live in the same country. We vote in the same elections. We respect the same laws. We all pay taxes. We all want a better life. We all want good public services. We all want to be ourselves and also belong. And we all have multiple overlapping identities, not narrowly nativist ones. So you can be someone in Stoke who is proud to be from Stoke, from up north, to be a postman or a business owner who supports Stoke City week in, week out, England in the World Cup, Team GB in the Olympics, and yes, Europe in the Ryder Cup. And that's not in contradiction with being British. It's about being British and yourself. And that broad sense of us is open to others who want to join us.
Philippe, thank you. Thank you, thank you. Faiza, I saw you nodding at one point when Philippe was speaking. What would you like to add to this debate as your first thoughts before we have a more wide discussion?
Yes, I mean, I agree with what was just said about how ugly the campaign got, and I think a lot of us felt quite unrooted by what was said and the messages we were hearing. And there was a massive surge in racist attacks. There was a massive surge in Islamophobia. That's all a sign that that campaign got very negative. I want to talk a bit about where we go forward now. And I agree that, well, I hope that Brexit could be a restart button on these things, but the problem is that for the most part, we're still hearing some of the same messages, and we're hearing our political leaders still play into the same idea of there is a kind of Britishness that goes back to an old idea of Englishness, and then there's everyone else. So that idea that if you're a citizen of the world, you're a citizen of nowhere, and that we're still hearing that tone, we're still hearing that. And I'm scared, genuinely, that Brexit and the way in which that campaign was held puts us in a straitjacket that takes us to an old idea of what it is to be, and maybe it was never really true anyway, of Englishness versus Britishness, which is, you know, is always tricky. But I come at this from more of an economics perspective, and so I'm not as well versed as others on this, but my feeling is going forward, because so much of that narrative is based on a lie, either because of the way in which we've been told that immigrants are taking all the jobs, or immigrants are taking all of our housing or public services, which actually factually is not true. There are some issues at the bottom end of the labour market, absolutely. But when you look at what's driving that, it's to do with the lack of power those people have because of deunionization. It's to do with what's happening in terms of low wages and the power that bosses have. Immigration is somewhere in that list, but it's not the top 5. And that's just what the evidence shows. So we can't move forward based on that lie, based on that toxic conversation that's unfortunately still happening. So going forward, of course, we have to think of identity and the identity project and what we want to consider as British, and that's why I was, shaking my head and nodding so much to what Philippe was just talking about. But for me, it's an identity project, and it's also an economic project. A lot of the reason why people will feel scared and threatened by immigrants is because they are scared for their economic livelihoods. So we need to do something about what we do in terms of the economic inequality in this country, the regions that have been left behind. And that's my worry sometimes when we focus too much, not only that have we put ourselves in a straitjacket that makes Britishness something that doesn't include people like me, but also that it makes it a pure identity project, a pure issue of just discussing what Britishness means, when we have to do something about the economic project as well. So I think when we look forward, we have to ask maybe a different question as well about what we aspire to be. But I'll leave it there.
Mary Lou, I took part in a legal seminar recently, a law seminar, which was about the impact of Brexit on Ireland. And one of the things that came through very clearly in discussions about how do you deal with this business of creating or maintaining a soft border and so on, was the very fact that after the peace process and the Good Friday Agreement, that Europe actually, and it's forgotten, played a rather vital role in all of this, and the ways in which sectarian divisions were submerged in the kind of overarching sense of people, north and south in Ireland, belonging to Europe and the European project. And that, in a way, helped to, if you like, override the sense of really difficult divisions that had been maintained for so long around the sectarian divide. So I just wondered what your reading is of what is happening post-Brexit and what that does in terms of issues of identity in Ireland.
Well, thank you, Helena, and I want to thank Henry, panel mix-up notwithstanding, for inviting me here to be part of this very important conversation. Just if Michael Gove is still in the building, Yanis Varoufakis actually advocated against Brexit. So I thought it was just important to finish out his line of reasoning. So how did it look from Ireland? Because we followed, obviously, the whole dynamic and debate. And from my eyes, and for us, it looked ugly. It looked as though genuine issues around globalisation and the effects of that for the working class in particular, issues that are well-founded, critiques around the European Union because it is an imperfect project. There is a democratic deficit. We need to look that in the eye. That those were almost colonised or hijacked for the purposes of what for us in Ireland will be experienced as a catastrophic act of political sabotage. And I'm using strong language because this is the reality. It is for us nothing short of a constitutional earthquake. And I use, again, strong language. So there is nobody in this room, whatever your view on Brexit, for the purposes of the island of Britain or for England, to have it very clearly stated in the clearest of language that this has the potential to wreck the Good Friday Agreement, to critically undermine the peace process. It has the absolute effect, an unavoidable effect if Theresa May has her way, of disrupting social and economic life on a very small island. And I have to say that there's anger in Ireland. It's not just in the north. We will not be the collateral damage in Tory boys throwing buns at each other. That's how we see it. And I want to say this too because I'm conscious that I'm not British. I share an island with many people who are British, vociferously British, and whom I am proud to call my fellow Irishmen and Irish women. It's not for me to tell you what to do. That's not my business. I respect the democratic processes engaged in. But I think we have to have a very clear sense of our interdependence. You know, I have been involved in many, many debates, Helena, in Ireland, because we have a lot of referendums and we've had lots of debates on European matters. And I'm on the record, if you care to check, positing lots of criticisms, which I believe to be valid. But what was astonishing here was that the Brexit was on the basis of some things that are actually really good for ordinary people. I think it's a good thing that we share the continent, that we can work, that we can live, that we can study right across each other's territories. That's a good thing, I would have thought, for ordinary people. So what we want is, obviously I'm an Irish Republican, we're working to end partition. Our country's been partitioned since the 1920s. I believe we're on the track for that to happen. It has to happen democratically, peacefully, and in a spirit of reconciliation. All of that goes without saying. But in the meantime, we have to look now to see how do you protect Ireland, north and south. And if you want, I'll finish on this, Helena. If people want a salutary lesson in how identity politics, as it's politely called, can be used and abused to cause real damage, look no further than across the water. Look no further to certain episodes and certain incendiary rhetoric that was seized upon. Now, I'm not suggesting that our peace process is going to collapse. I don't believe that's the case. It is robust. But I tell you what, we are not prepared to tolerate anybody who gambles with gains that have been so hard fought for. And it seems to me, with the greatest of respect to Michael Gove, who was against the Good Friday Agreement when it happened, it still seems that there are some who are tone deaf really to the democratic view. In the north of Ireland, 56% voted to stay. How's that for democracy? If Michael's here, he might like to ponder on that. Thank you.
And Mary Lou, I just wanted to, talking about the anger in Ireland, many people over here don't know that as part of the peace process, one of the things that the south of Ireland did was actually changed its own constitution and removed any claim of right on the counties in the north of Ireland, and did that as an act of reconciliation in order to make possible the soft border, the process for peace, a sense in which there could be those collaborative things without this feeling that there was an attempt always there to make that claim. And that makes people feel we went the extra mile, we wanted this too, we have made sacrifices to make peace possible, and yet somehow you haven't been very conscious of the impact of this on all of us.
Well, I think that's true, but also just to say this, and in all fairness, and it's a matter of public record, successive British government, albeit it was a bit stop-start at times, engaged, took risks, took chances. So, you know, the British system, if you like, has skin in the game in terms of building peace in Ireland. And to me, it's an astonishing thing that anybody holding the office of PM, anybody in 10 Downing Street, could be quite as cavalier as the current government appears to be in respect of a creation which is in the interests of all of us. All of us now need to normalise, and more than normalise, build real deep democratic bonds between our respective islands. We live in a globalised world. This is a necessity economically and socially for all of us. So it is a matter of astonishment. I should also say this on the issue of citizenship. Everybody born in Ireland is entitled to Irish citizenship and by extension European citizenship. So everybody born in the north of Ireland is de facto can claim European citizenship. So there's a debate going on across the water saying, well, so what does that mean in a post-Brexit environment? Also, applications for Irish passports are through the roof. So anybody with an Irish granny or great-granny or great-grandfather, I was talking to somebody from family from Tipperary earlier on, we can see the figures have gone literally through the roof, because I think people do value. I'm a proud Irish woman, and I respect everybody's sense of their place and their history and their heritage. I think that's all good stuff, but it's only really brilliant stuff when you can recognise it in the other. And I think there's plenty of space for us to accommodate all of that in a way that enriches all of us, whether we're British, whether we're Irish, whether we choose to set aside those tags altogether.
Sashy. Sashy, your reflections on what has been taking place.
So I guess as the final speaker and sitting in the middle of 7 people, I should really speak to a consensus. And luckily, that's what I hope I'm going to do. I think when we talk about Brexit and ideas of who we are and where we belong in the world, it's citizenship and globalization, not just citizenship and immigration, that we should be talking about. And there's 3 main parts that I'm just going to speak to. The first thing is that the rhetoric of immigration is a self-harming exercise. We must wake up to the fact that immigration isn't something that's just happening to us. We're not victims of it, but it's the fact that people are moving between nation states all around the world in increasing numbers and for increasing reasons. The UK is not a victim of immigration, and it's self-defeating to characterize ourselves in this way. As Vidya Ram, a former advisor to the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, put it, the impression Britain is giving to countries such as India is, we want your business, but we don't want your people. We're really risking and damaging how we're seen in the world, and that is not what Brexit is supposed to be about. Secondly, beyond the rhetoric of immigration, the reality is that global movements that affect the citizens in this country move far beyond just the movement of people. The citizens are also concerned with the movement of services, goods, capital, data, and environmental protection. And it's really important that we start to think about how the state manages those situations on our behalf. So we've seen today a global cyber attack that's affected our NHS. And we've seen that data protection is going to become an increasingly important issue in the 21st century. We see that climate change isn't going away. And these are all things that are affecting the citizen and that requires the state to do more on its behalf. Citizens need the state to look after their concerns, whether that's protecting the use of citizens' data, whether that's the natural environment, or whether it's ensuring that the quality of life and the standards of living are not damaged by currency fluctuations, which is what we're seeing at the moment. This is the reality of where we are now. Citizenship, the state and globalisation. So the final thing I want to say is the way to best serve citizens is to increase the values in our politics, not to decrease them. And we have to pool those values with other nation states into policies that can affect change. If this process, if Brexit is used as a mechanism to shoehorn immigration into matters of globalisation that affect the citizens, it will damage all of us and we'll all feel the effects. So that's why we, as an organisation, 89UP, have been seeking a consensus that free trade and human rights are bedfellows. They go together. We should be thinking about them at the same time, and that is the best way in which the state can manage the situation of globalisation for the citizen. And just to finish, we talked a little bit about identity politics and how that's driving the agenda at the moment. But actually, I think what people are seeking is value politics. And there's a danger that if we divide the country into somewheres and anywheres, we're not serving the interests of the everyones. And value politics are so important to where we are now, especially that there are people around the world now actively working against it. So I'll just give you a quote by Rex Tillerson, the current US Secretary of State. I think it's really important that all of us understand the difference between policy and values. Our values around freedom, human dignity, the way people are treated, those are our values. Those are not our policies.
Says it all.
That says it all.
Thanks, Philippe.
David, I want to give you a little more time because you've heard that a challenge to your assertion that there was no evidence that this is all anecdotal. And I'm not sure that's true because the Media Centre at King's College at London University, headed up by Martin Moore, did a very careful research of all of the news coverage in the run-up to the Brexit referendum. And they were very clear that a large quantity of the coverage, so it wasn't just dog whistle, overt coverage looking at issues affecting the referendum were about immigration and the impact of immigration. And so there is evidence out there. This is not just the story of the man in Bradford or the man in different places or anecdotal stuff. So, and I'd like you to deal with your thesis.
I agreed with you. I said, I think immigration was the single most important factor behind it. What I don't agree is that the views about immigration that most people in Britain have was in any way represented by the man in Bradford. Hostility to large...
Barnsley,
sorry.
Bradford would get really upset.
The hostility to large-scale immigration has risen more or less in line with the numbers over the last 20 years. And at the same time, racist attitudes and beliefs in Britain have been in radical decline. I would ask you to consider the overlapping of those two things. I think we're being emotionally unintelligent here. I've written a book and I've made this distinction between the people I call the people from anywhere, about 20% of the population, 25% of the population, most of us here, we tend to be highly educated and very mobile. And on the other hand, there's a group, about 50% of the population, who tend to be much less well educated and much less mobile. One of the important distinctions, several important distinctions between these value groups, I've invented the labels, by the way. I haven't invented the value groups. They're there in the British Social Attitude Survey, if you want to have a look. And the attitudes to change is one of the things that distinguishes these two groups. Also, attitudes to group attachment. People from somewhere feel much more strong group attachments to group and place, whether it's nation, place, ethnicity, and so on. This goes also for ethnic minorities somewheres too, by the way. And I think just to look down upon these attachments, anywheres tend not to feel these attachments to anything like the same degree, but I don't think you can just dismiss them out of hand. And particularly as I call most somewheres decent populists. They've gone along with the great liberalisation of British society on race, on sexuality, on gender over the last 30 or 40 years. But we have different, there are big arguments about definitions of things like racism and indeed extreme nationalism. And I think anywhere people often caricature what is going on. I think if conservatives and centrists tend to see racism as about hostility or contempt for outgroups of various kinds, ethnic or religious outgroups. Liberals and people on the left often have a broader definition. Obviously, they agree with that definition, but they think it's too strong an attachment to your own group. Now, obviously, it is possible to have too strong an attachment to your own group. That's why we have anti-discrimination laws. But attachment to your own group and wariness about rapid social change are not in themselves bad things. And I think anywheres are often too contemptuous of those views.
David, I think that we've got to sort of disentangle it. There's more in it. And one of my concerns is that here you have Sayeeda feels very much that she's someone from somewhere. She's a Yorkshire woman.
Yeah, I know.
Right?
Yeah.
Mary Lou is very much somebody from somewhere. She feels that she's an Irish woman, and she's very proud of the fact that she is Irish. And I'm not sure that you can do this business of dividing the world up between the folk who are the kind of liberal elite who are from anywhere, and because they happen to be perhaps more open to the wider world. I think there are plenty of people from somewhere who are also open in that way. And I think there are some people who are from anywhere who are also narrow-minded bigots. So I don't think that you can actually create those very hard, fast notions about the distinctions between peoples in our nation and the ways in which they've parted company.
Well, read the book. I have a slightly more nuanced account in the book. I mean, obviously, I'm giving a cartoonish account of my own book, because I got 2 minutes to do it in.
Just quickly on
that.
Actually, I think David's commentary about the present state of domestic politics will probably serve the Prime Minister well at the general election, but it's not something that's going to solve some of the vast array of questions that are coming our way in the next 5 years. And this is the problem that we face, is that we're prioritising comment on current domestic politics when we're just talking about vision on a global scale.
No, I'm very anxious that we have an opportunity of having a discussion. I've got this very terrific panel here who are going to help us engage with some ideas. So I see lines up of folk already wanting to contribute, and I'm going to start taking them. I'm going to ask this woman first to ask a question, and I'll take a few questions before I give them to my audience, to my panel.
Thank you. My name's Emma Collins. As an EU citizen who's been here for 20 years, who has recently had to take the decision to close down my business and make my staff redundant because of the sterling devaluation caused by Brexit, and who myself potentially face having to jump through administrative hoops with an uncertain outcome if I want to stay here, I would like to ask the panel, should I continue to fight for a future in the UK? Or should my husband, who happens to be Irish, incidentally, and I take our qualifications from Cambridge and Imperial College, our tax contributions, and our British children with us to make a fresh start somewhere else?
Emma, thank you. Very interesting question. Great, thank you. Right.
Thank you. My name's Burnett, and I come from a very rural part of, West Wales.
You're from somewhere.
I have always been from somewhere and everywhere. I have an American mother. I'm a Celt. I was born in Germany under the British Army of Occupation of the Rhine. I still struggle with my identity. Anyway, thank you, Helena. I'd like to ask the panel whether they think that the main problem we face, which is underlying the problem of Brexit, is actually climate change. And I've been here for 1.5 days, and I think the first time that was I heard it mentioned was with the gentleman here, and thank you very much. And whether this is the biggest issue. The South will move within my lifetime to the North. It will move. It will move because the South is overheating because of climate change. China will come here through population pressure. And I think that this what I consider to be, I'm sorry, a pathetic government fiddling while Rome burns can do diddly squat to stop this, and that we need to deal with the big issues. So my question is that where do those issues come into climate change, identity, immigration, Ireland, migration, etc.? Thank you.
My name is Jana Pinto.
Sorry, I didn't hear your name.
My name is Jana Pinto. I was born in Brazil. It's my understanding as a legal researcher that the problem with immigration in this country isn't gaining back border control, but capacity and constraint. Capacity as defined in production engineering. I am yet to see a report which says what the NHS capacity is, what the housing capacity is, what the schooling capacity is. Question. When will the UK design interdisciplinary immigration regulations, and what would be the hurdles? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, please.
My name's Catherine, I'm from Cambridge. When I woke up on the day of the results of the referendum, I was dismayed and angry that a small portion of the country had taken away my rights to be a European citizen. Does the panel, and I also understand, I totally sympathise with EU citizens who are living in the UK and wish to stay here. Does the panel feel at all that there's any chance that we can have any challenge in the courts to retain our citizenships, or do you think the European Union will allow us to keep in the citizenship that we now hold?
You have to find yourself an Irish granny. Everybody needs an Irish granny. Please.
My name's Suzy and I've thought quite a lot about the immigration thing, and with a view to staying in Europe, and really it's an idea that I haven't ever heard discussed, but it seems sort of quite obvious to me that there's problems within all the other, lots of countries in Europe about immigration as well, which is probably why we're really Le Pen, we know about that. So the idea I had was, every country could have a number based on land mass, population, and all the other factors that people that know about these things, would suggest. And then on the basis of that, within Europe, every country has that number. So when it gets full, so our number could be, say, 2 million. When we're full up, people have to move to another country who has another, not top ceiling number. And so we're all still within Europe, and it's free movement, but there's just a capacity statement there, And I think that would solve a lot of the problems of why people wanted to leave, because I think there is people being able to cope psychologically with the idea of, so people coming, and the idea that a whole country of people could have actually come here, within 1 year. And I personally found that very hard, like 12 years ago, even though I'm totally Europe and
okay,
think,
so Suzy, you're talking about, couldn't we have a much more clear numbers thing on assessing?
And suggest it to Europe as an idea to take them forward, as well.
Okay, thank you very much. Over here.
I'm 19 years old, and I voted to remain. Lucy. I voted Remain, and at the minute I feel like I'm quite fed up with people trying to define my identity for me, and I think actually the fact that I feel quite embarrassed to be British at the minute because of the image that we're portraying, in that, bearing in mind our history, we have this kind of British arrogance that actually we only want the people who are going to benefit us, as I say, bearing in mind, knowing our history. And actually, I think what I want to know is what hope can we give to everybody, but particularly young people who feel like we're being confined to a kind of an idea of Britishness that actually I don't want to identify with, and I would identify as a citizen of the world any day over identifying as British at the minute.
Thank you, Lucy. Here.
Hello, thank you for coming. First of all, I'd like to thank Sayeeda and Faiza for setting precedent for young female British Muslims in the field.
What's your name?
My name's Sam.
Sam.
Hello, nice to meet you. First of all, to David, the statement you made that that the Brexit campaign and the instances of racism was anecdotal. Well, I disagree with that notion.
I didn't say that.
No, what David pointed out, and he made it clear afterwards, was that he wasn't suggesting that it was only anecdotal, that was one of the elements. What he was saying was that it's only anecdotal that Britain is racist because of
Britain has become less
individual.
racist. There was a spike in hate crime. There's absolutely no question about that. It went up from about 100 incidents a day to 200 incidents a day for about 2 months, and then it came back to the normal level.
Okay, can I carry on?
Pretty nasty stuff, David.
I know. But I'm just giving you the facts. Yeah, it was a spike, all right, and it went back to the normal horrible level, if you like. But you know, it went to extra horrible for a period.
Horrible to extra horrible.
It's just that Muslims have been made to fit a certain narrative since the war on terror, and I've always believed that if you're afraid of people on a lower socioeconomic scale, you're usually being manipulated by someone who's on a higher socioeconomic scale. And I'm worried about, instead of branding people as racist and bigoted, how do we educate them that their economic hardship is not the result of what the demagoguery we see in politics, but what policy that is crippling lower middle class and working class white people. And I'm just interested in your opinions on how we can educate people about economics and why they're actually suffering instead of scapegoating it.
Hi. I know where I was born, but I've spent an entire lifetime not knowing where I was from. My parents were both born on the Falls. I was born in England. And
what's your name?
My name's James.
James.
It's strange, that's what most people ask when I go over to Belfast. What's your name? Now, my family throughout have been Irish nationalists, Sinn Féin voters. And what that left me with in England was a great sense of detachment. Because all my friends were English, my accent is English, unless I'm speaking to my mum. And I still to this day feel this detachment. However, when I go to Belfast now, I see young, creative, incredibly vibrant people from both sides of, well, essentially they're secular, so their side doesn't actually matter. What makes me very, very uncomfortable is that since this Brexit issue has come up in Ireland, I've seen both sides in Northern Ireland revert to type. We're hearing hard borders, alignment to Britain, and we're seeing United Ireland arguments. What I want to know is, what are Sinn Féin doing to represent those young people who do not identify with either of those arguments, who are proudly Northern Irish? Because the thing is that I feel so proud of them, but envious. Because I didn't get that because of, for want of a better term, these old-fashioned values that are being repeated today by your party and by the other parties there. So what are Sinn Féin going to do to represent those people?
Good, okay. Don't answer, I'll take it back to you. I'm going to take a whole set of questions because we'll run out of time and I want to bring it back. Please, yes?
Yeah. So Dimi Pozios, I'm an EU national. And so this is the third time that I'm living here now in the UK. I came here first as a student, then I came back home, then I came back here for an internship, and then I'm finally here since last year in Britain, which up until last year was, you know, for good, an EU member. So my question is very, very simple. It's both for the panel and I guess as well for the May government. How do you expect to have an immigration policy that is attractive to EU nationals when Brexit is the exact refusal and rejection of EU values?
What's your name?
Dimi Pozios.
What?
Dimi Pozios. D-I-M-Y.
D-I-M-Y. Dimi, that's fine.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Now, I can take one more question, but I'm sorry to all of you who but this lady here, I can't because that's 5 minutes to go and I want my panel to answer some of these issues. Please.
I'm Diana Good. I'd like to hear your views on why it is in this general election that both the Tories and Labour parties are supporting the end of the free movement of people if they're not pandering to the xenophobic vote behind Brexit.
And your name, sorry, your first name? Your first name?
Diana.
Diana, yeah. Now, we've got a whole set of questions here, and I'm going to parry them around, but I'm going to let you, Mary Lou, deal with the Irish question, which was James was saying, he really has been heartened by the fact that when he goes to Belfast now, people, until Brexit, people were really losing that sectarian thing and were actually thinking of themselves much more as belonging to the same community and had thrown away all that stuff that had poisoned the whole kind of community up there. And why are you jumping on, as he sees it, Sinn Féin and the DUP and other parties jumping back on the sort of separate business and the sectarian divides again and talking about things that inevitably cause alienation and a return to the past?
Thank you, Helena, and thank you, James, for that question. And if you don't mind, I'm going to answer it, and then with your forbearance, I have to go because I actually have to get a plane to Belfast. I know that. So the reality is for Ireland in a partition state that it's a contested matter. And the Good Friday Agreement that was signed up to in 1998 and ratified and so on actually provides a mechanism for ending partition. And there are those who argue for that on the basis of democracy and political advancement, and those that resist. And I don't see that changing. And I'll be honest with you, as an Irish Republican, I don't see that it should. To your point, James, around the new generation and the new hope and the new atmosphere, I couldn't agree with you more. I'm a Dubliner. And I remember times as a Dubliner where you would be very anxious going into the city of Belfast. Certainly if you were from around the Falls there, you'd think twice about going down the Shankill. You know that story. We have moved on immensely from that time. And there is a whole new generation, not just generally, but indeed a new generation in political life, and I can speak for our own party in that regard, who see that when we win, we need to win for everyone. And some people do define themselves as Northern Irish, but lots of people don't. Lots of people identify as British if they're unionists, and lots of people simply call themselves Irish. And we need to, not to try and shout down those legitimate sentiments. We need to accept that that's where it's at. And then we need to figure out, in a democratic way and in a respectful way, how you harness that and how you move forward democratically. Ireland should never have been partitioned in the 1920s. So in a way, we're talking about cleaning up messes. We're cleaning up a big mess of centuries in making, but copper fastened in the 20s. We will do it. I'm very confident that we can do it peacefully and democratically. And I think it comes back to a point that was made around globalization and the sentiment of people who feel excluded or left behind, or, you know, we need to listen to that as well. And globalization has been tough for people. And I absolutely agree with the point that globalization and human rights have to go hand in hand. And if you have newcomers from Central or Eastern Europe, or navvies coming from Ireland, the west of Ireland, as was the case here generations ago, no dogs, no Irish need apply. A lot of that was about people feeling economically insecure. And if you have unscrupulous bosses who won't pay the rate for the job, who won't observe standards, and where those standards aren't enforced, of course that is a recipe for collision amongst working people. How could it be anything other than that? So I think that's the stuff that we need to take on. But as for Ireland, James, do not despair. Do not despair. Yeah.
I can't, unfortunately.
We represent them. We are elected by those young people.
James, James. Mary Lou's answered. It's 1 o'clock. I've got to be finishing this up, and I want to give some answers to the questions we're asked. Mary Lou, I want to thank you on behalf of all of us for being here and say goodbye.
Nice to meet you. Nice to see you. All the best.
I'm going to give you a chance to come in. I'm just going to quickly run through a number of things. Emma, who started this off in the questions asked, said she's been a European Union citizen here for 20 years. She's married to an Irishman, and they've got children who are British, and should she go or should she stay? And the answer is, you have to stay. Oddly asked, was it not really just about climate change? Isn't this the most pressing issue of the day? Certainly it's one of the biggest issues of the day. And the answer is that we have to keep that high on the agenda. And the best way of doing it is by doing it with other people from other nations. And unfortunately, we are taking ourselves out of one of the great units that had a very good policy around some of these issues of climate change. I want to just deal with, and before I take it to people here, who, particularly to our politician in our midst. Jana Pinto, so Suzy Rushton, and indeed Diana at the end asked, our two major political parties have now basically conceded the idea that free movement is not on the cards. Both parties are saying we are not going to have free movement. Both are saying that that's over. And they're basically saying there has to be something done about immigration. Is that inevitable? And I'm going to run around the panel, because what their suggestion is that it has to be a better system, and Janina talks about how it should be more interdisciplinary. Suzy Rushton said there should be allocations and so on. Diana saying, you know, have we ceded the pass? Is free movement over? I'll give you the chance to answer that. Is free movement over?
Well, we had, we've been through phases when we had complete free movement across the world practically about 100 years ago. And it's only over the last 100 years ago that we started to have various levels of immigration policy, and then passports and having to be tested at ports. And
but the reason why is because ease of travel is so great. I mean, ease of travel has changed hugely.
And the politics in the United Kingdom on all sides of the political divide clearly show that the consensus is that free movement is over. But I think what we failed to address, and we haven't addressed in this election campaign on all sides, is that there are two sides to this negotiation for Brexit. There is what we want, and then there is what Europe wants. There is what we think we're going to get, and then there is what Europe thinks they're going to give. And ultimately, we may say free movement is over, but at what cost? So I would say, it's not over until it's over. We have to, I don't know what this negotiation is going to look like. I think you made a very strong point when the Indians say you want our trade, but you don't want our people. We have to make a decision. If we say, if the political consensus is free movement is over, and Europe says, well, that's linked to free trade, then is the political consensus in this country ready for the fact that free trade is over? I'm not sure we're there yet.
The largest group of people that come to this country, by the way, come from India, outside of Europe. I mean, they've been consistently the largest group of people outside.
I mean, that's fine, but
they continue to come in pretty large numbers.
You can't cherry-pick globalisation, and by selling the line of somewheres and anywheres, that's what you're saying to people that you can do. It can't be done, whether it's in the European Union, whether it's in India.
We want a globalisation that people feel comfortable with, in which the nation-state remains important. That is what people want.
It's a line of rhetoric.
I want to say to Catherine from Cambridge, who said that she was grieving over her loss of EU citizenship, is there any way back? And I want to repeat what's just been said, it's not over until it's over. Can I just... What do people want to say to Lucy, who says, she's really tired of British arrogance, she's young, she's 19, and she hates this narrow idea of Britishness. She feels that she's a citizen of the world. What are we going to say to our young? She's saying she feels ashamed, and that many of her own age cohort feel the same way. Anybody got something they want to say on that? Philippe?
Yeah, I mean, Lucy, I empathise with the way that you feel. Clearly, there are many people who feel the same way by the nativist turn that Britain has taken since the Brexit vote. And clearly that's the way it's interpreted by the rest of the world. Trump calling himself Mr. Brexit, Marine Le Pen saying she's best placed to deal with the Britain of Theresa May. It's a sad time to be British in that sense. On the other hand, you're free to define yourself in the way that you want. take a different definition of your own identity, take a different definition of Britishness. Don't allow yourself to be put into a box by people who take a narrow and reductive view of what Britishness is.
Faiza, do you want to say anything on that?
Yeah, I mean, I would say the same, but I would say that looking forward, we have to make more of the inequality. So the other question about what's happening in terms of dividing and distracting people, putting immigrants against white working class, it's really unhelpful. It's not the case. Actually, they share a lot of the same problems. How we tell those stories, there's some really positive things happening as well. You know, the biggest group of new children born are mixed dual heritage, mixed race. And so there are some positive stories to be told too. And to young people, please just vote as well. I mean, that's the biggest thing you can do. And I just want to say very quickly, if I can.
I'm going to just let Sayeeda have a word, but I just want to say to Sam, the young Asian woman who said, you know, why is it that we aren't making a better argument about the economics of this to ordinary working class people who in places where there's no immigration think that immigration is the problem, and that we're not telling them that, in fact, many of their own economic problems are to do with other things, and that we're so poor in getting those messages across. I want to say to Sayeeda, what do you say to the young woman who says, I feel I'm a citizen of the world, and you're taking that away from me?
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to respond to Lucy and to Sam. You guys are generation change. You can determine who it is that you want to be. I mean, you have so many identities, even if I take my own. You're British, you have ethnic origins like I do, I have a religious identity, I have a political identity. And what I would say to you is that it's up to you how you define that and who you are at any one point. I think it's the false narrative to say if you're one, you can't be the other. I think the people have these multiple complex identities. Some days I'm just a woman, other days I'm actually a Tory, other days I'm a Muslim. You kind of combine those identities. The worry I have with policy making in this area is that this concept of Britishness, British values as we call them, is a reductive list, which is historically inaccurate and is actually inconsistently applied. I mean, what I saw in government, for example, was that we would talk about what our British values were, and then we would consistently make policies which conflicted with those very stated values. So I think as young people, the one thing you can do in asserting who you are is by holding politicians like me and others to account, by saying we want our politicians to say what they believe and do what they say. They're really simple questions.
David, I'm going to let you come in here. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I would say to the young woman, the 19-year-old woman, I would say your views are perfectly legitimate. They are held by about 5% of the population of this country, a group I call global villages in my book. And you should also, I think, acknowledge more than you do that there is a new Britishness. It is not any longer about superiority, apart from perhaps a tiny number of people who are xenophobic, isn't it? About 5 to 7% of the population who are very shared. It is a new kind of Britishness has emerged. We're much more European now than we were a couple of generations ago. You see it everywhere, in football, in diet, in voting systems, except for the Westminster one. We've been Europeanized, and we will go on being Europeanized. And I think there'll be much more continuity on, we'll continue to have visa-free travel. On movement, there'll be much more continuity than people seem to fear. But I mean, the final point I'd like to make, as an example of this new Britishness, all of the non-white British friends I have, when they go to continental Europe, they always come back and they say, this country is more tolerant than the countries I've just been in. I've had much more harassment and hostility expressed to me in those countries than I do in everyday life in Britain. I would just like you to consider that point too.
Well, listen, I want to thank our panel for taking part in this discussion. I want to thank all of you for being a fabulous audience. And I want to thank those who are organising this convention. The opportunity to speak and talk about these issues is absolutely vital, and long may it continue. Thank you very much. Have a good lunch.